one. Well, good morning and good evening, everyone, to all our online viewers, wherever you are. My name is Russell Shao. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated to Taiwan policy research. Good morning and good evening, everyone, to all our online viewers, wherever you are. My name is Russell Shao. Excuse me. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan policy. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and informed opinions about Taiwan policy. We also organize regular public seminars, like the virtual seminar that you are all watching here today on current developments related to Taiwan. We also organize an annual symposium focused on US policy towards Taiwan in the fall. In addition to these policy-focused research programs, we also have academic opportunities, including fellowship opportunities for researchers who are interested to conduct short-term field research in Taiwan, as well as for researchers from Taiwan to conduct short-term field research here in Washington, D.C. I'll be remiss if I did not begin today's program by also thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, our advisors, as well as the staff and interns of GTI who make all our programs possible. Now, if you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so on our website by visiting www.globaltaiwan.org. So let's begin today's program. In January of this year, President Tsai Ing-wen scored a resounding victory in her re-election as Taiwan's president with a record-breaking number of popular votes of over 8 million. Also, with record high approval ratings ranging in the high 60s and 70s among numerous polls, President Tsai entered her second term, which began just last week on May 20th, with a strong electoral mandate. This came, of course, with a little help from Beijing, and is a gift that seems to keep giving. Beijing's ruthless deployment of sharp power in Hong Kong and suppressing the people's liberty over the anti-extradition law protests there have not only been the focus of international concern, but are certainly being closely watched by the people in Taiwan. Indeed, that and the ramming through of the national security law have cast away any doubt among the population in the island about the intent behind one country, two systems, and are arguably bringing the people there closer in line with President Tsai and her ruling party's sensible, of keeping the CCP at arm's length and her emphasis on the importance of maintaining Taiwan's democracy and sovereignty in her dealings with Beijing. Nevertheless, her administration still faces numerous challenges, both domestic and international. Foremost among the latter, the novel coronavirus, commonly known as COVID-19, presents both unique opportunities and challenges for Taiwan's international space and cross-strait relations, respectively. While Taiwan has received unprecedented international attention and praise for its successful containment of COVID-19, and also because of its unjust exclusion from international bodies. These were exemplified. The support was exemplified by the outpour of support for Taiwan's observership in the WHO. At the same time, China has been flexing its sharp power over Taiwan through political warfare and disinformation, and increasingly flexing its growing hard power through military pressure, placing the island democracy in a perilous position and raising serious concerns about deterrence and the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. I would note here in some shameless publicity that GTI is in the process of preparing a report on the topic of strengthening resiliency against sharp power and hard power deterrence in US-Taiwan relations that Chip, Steve, and I are co-authoring. So the discussion here today will certainly help to feed into our study. But it's not only Taiwan, but her diplomatic and non-diplomatic allies that are feeling the heat from Beijing. This heavy-handed tactic was clearly on display earlier this year when Beijing threatened to economically cripple the African nation of Eswatini, Taiwan's lone diplomatic partner in Africa, and has exerted immense pressure on the countries expressing support for Taiwan's observership in WHO. These are just a couple in a growing long list of examples. Yet, at the same time as Chinese pressure on Taiwan grows, Taiwan's relations with its most important non-diplomatic ally and security partner, the United States, have been trending in the positive direction. On the legislative side, Congress passed and the president signed the Taiwan Travel Act, as well as the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative Act, more conveniently known as the Taipei Act, regularized arms sales, regular and public naval transits through the Taiwan Strait, as well as other measures. This increased tempo is occurring within a larger context of strategic competition between the United States and China, intensifying, and Beijing is increasing its pressure campaign against Taipei to isolate the Tsai administration. These have been accompanied by visible and tangible support by the United States for Taiwan that are becoming more apparent. Indeed, this was clearly reflected by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's congratulatory message and the video remarks by Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell, as well as the White House Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger at President Tsai's inauguration ceremony. Recently, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, penned an article in the National Review stating, and I quote, "The U.S. must provide a full-throated defense of Taiwan's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now is the time for a declaratory statement of policy committing the United States to the defense of Taiwan," end quote. In her second inaugural address, President Tsai emphasized the need for greater defense and security cooperation between the United States and Taiwan, and the need for coexistence in the Taiwan Strait. So, GTI assembled today's virtual seminar to discuss the trajectory of U.S.-Taiwan relations and cross-strait relations as President Tsai now begins her second term in an ever more uncertain strategic environment. We truly have an all-star panel whom will help us unpack all the issues, and I'll briefly introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we'll have the Honorable Heino Klink, who was sworn in as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. In this role, he oversees all U.S. defense policy throughout the region, advancing U.S. national security interests through defense strategy development, security cooperation, contingency planning, and program oversight. Next, we'll have J. Michael Cole, who is a senior non-resident fellow with GTI. In addition to this post, he is a senior non-resident fellow with the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Nottingham, research associate with the French Center for Research on Contemporary China, among other positions. Prior to his think tank life, Michael was an intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in Ottawa. Then we have Lieutenant General Wallace Chip Gregson, who is a senior director for China and the Pacific at the Center for National Interest. General Gregson most recently served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs under the Obama administration. And finally, we have Ambassador Stephen Young, who has served as a U.S. diplomat for over 33 years with assignments in Washington, Taipei, Moscow, Beijing, Kyrgyzstan, and Hong Kong. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic, director of the American Institute in Taiwan, as well as the Consul General to Hong Kong. I should note that also both Chip and Steve are on GTI's advisory board. So each speaker will provide opening comments for about 10 minutes each. The opening statement will then be followed by a moderated discussion, and we'll leave around 15 minutes at the end of the session for audience Q&A. Now, for the audience members, if you would like to ask a question during the Q&A session, you may do so by emailing contact@globaltaiwan.org or by using the chat function on our YouTube page, which is on the right side of the screen. Heino, please kick things off for us here.
Thank you very much, Russell, and good morning to everyone out there, wherever you may be, particularly for my friends in Taiwan who may be dialing in. I really appreciate the opportunity this morning to talk a little bit about the Department of Defense's perspective on U.S.-Taiwan relations, and also to discuss some of the current developments in U.S.-Taiwan defense and security cooperation, particularly in the context of President Tsai's second term in office. Thank you again to Russell and his team at the Global Taiwan Institute for not only today's session, but the work it does every day to enhance and promote U.S.-Taiwan relations. Since its inception, GTI has been an important voice in Washington and has helped advance the bilateral U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So today's discussion comes at a very opportune time for us to review recent progress in U.S.-Taiwan defense and security cooperation as we look into the future. Since President Tsai was first elected in 2016, we have witnessed China's increasingly assertive actions toward Taiwan. China's whole of government pressure tactics directly challenge Taiwan's respect for the rule of law, its healthy civil society, and its transparent governance model. Indeed, as we have seen most recently during the current COVID pandemic, Taiwan's transparent, vibrant, and innovative democracy has enabled its effective and successful response to COVID-19. Like every leader, President Tsai made clear in her inaugural address that a priority will continue to be strengthening Taiwan's vibrant economy and ensuring the prosperity for the people of Taiwan. This strong economy is a foundation for a strong democracy and Taiwan's ability to preserve its way of life. Of particular concern to the Department of Defense, especially as President Tsai continues to lead Taiwan for a second term, is Xi Jinping's doubling down on the threat of force against Taiwan. We have observed in Chinese military activities in and surrounding Taiwan's air and maritime space, additional and unprecedented military pressure. This pressure through the PLA's posture and its increasingly provocative exercises and operations increase the risk of miscommunication and miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait and harm peace and stability throughout the Indo-Pacific. The PLA's military activities and pressure aimed at Taiwan test both Taiwan's ability to respond and the U.S. commitment under the Taiwan Relations Act. Relatedly, I know there's been much public debate and attention to whether Xi Jinping would conduct some sort of attack on Taiwan before or after the inauguration. The fact that we are having these debates publicly is important, proving that Taiwan, located on the front lines against China, remains an important partner in our own operations, activities, and investments in the Indo-Pacific. Moreover, particularly given all that is happening in Hong Kong today, I imagine that Beijing will not win many hearts and minds if the CCP's leadership tries to move the needle of coercion even closer towards conflict. It is in this strategic environment that the Trump administration and the Department of Defense continue to faithfully implement the TRA as part of a broader commitment to the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific. As Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense Dave Helvey said previously, at GTI in fact, the TRA has been the bedrock of our bilateral relations with Taiwan for over 40 years and has helped ensure Taiwan remains secure, confident, and free from coercion. Taiwan is on the front lines at a time that the PLA's strike and force projection capabilities are rapidly advancing. Taiwan therefore plays a critical role in deterring Chinese aggression and maintaining peace and stability throughout the region. The department continues to believe that the effective whole of government implementation of Taiwan's overall defense concept, referred to as ODC, is critical in ensuring that Taiwan can deter, delay, or deny actions by an aggressor. Taiwan knows that it must build a combat credible military commensurate with the threat it faces. The stakes for President Tsai to continue to tackle this demand as she operationalizes the ODC could not be higher. Last week, like many of you, I watched President Tsai's inauguration speech with great interest to see what she would say about Taiwan's security and ongoing defense reforms in light of the PRC's continued military pressure. In her speech, she set out three primary priorities for Taiwan's national defense. Number one, accelerating the development of asymmetric capabilities. Number two, substantive reforms to Taiwan's military, reserve, and mobilization systems. And three, building a modern military management system that emphasizes a professional fighting force. This is an ambitious defense agenda, but one that suggests that an even greater focus on preparing Taiwan for the growing threat it faces. The department is committed to continued implementation of the TRA and assisting Taiwan to make needed changes to ensure Taiwan is best prepared to respond to any and all threats against its people. We will continue to support Taiwan through security cooperation and defense engagements to ensure that Taiwan Armed Forces have the right tools in the toolkit as Tsai continues to adjust Taiwan's preparedness and response capabilities. The department does not necessarily publicly talk about specific Taiwan defense requirements in a conceptual or in an academic way. As an example, you really don't need to look any further than our own U.S. services to understand that our forces have had to adapt to a changing reality, not only in light of increasing anti-access area denial threats globally, but also given the networked high-end force structure and capabilities of our competitors. The U.S. force structure is continuously adapting to change threats, and I know that Secretary Esper remains laser focused on this effort. It's because of our own focus and adaptation that we are in dialogue with our partners and allies, including Taiwan, and encouraging to prioritize distributed, maneuverable, decentralized, and cost-effective capabilities in the face of an adversary that spends much more and fields capabilities much faster and has expressed a willingness to use force. Taiwan must employ a force that leverages its strength in terms of geography, advanced technology, a highly skilled workforce, and innovative and patriotic society, all while exploiting its adversaries' vulnerabilities. The department believes that platforms and capabilities that are distributed, maneuverable, and decentralized, or to put it very simply, large numbers of small things are critical to strengthening Taiwan's military deterrent capability. These include highly mobile coastal defense cruise missiles, short-range air defense, naval mines, small fast attack craft, mobile artillery, and advanced surveillance assets, all of which are well suited for Taiwan's geography and the mission of island defense. As we continue to work with the Tsai administration to sharpen our focus in these areas, the department is committed to current FMS cases that support Taiwan's efforts to recapitalize elements of its conventional force structure. A combat-credible, robust military deterrent on Taiwan requires more than investments in the appropriate types of capabilities and supporting infrastructure. Therefore, we are also supportive of President Tsai's continued efforts to strengthen the personnel system, the officers, NCOs, conscripts, and reservists that are critical to executing the mission of defending Taiwan. It's imperative that every modern military updates its doctrine, operational concepts, and tactics to ensure its force has adjusted to the requirements of modern warfare. You all know that this was a focus of former Secretary Mattis and continues to be a focus of Secretary Esper as well. Primarily because we remain focused on preparedness against our long-term strategic competitors and that there is no substitute for readiness. That's the case for U.S. Armed Forces as well as the Taiwan Armed Forces. So we are also focused on updating force designs that have been largely unchanged since the Cold War. Tough decisions about areas where U.S. forces can assume greater risk and divest defense resources are accompanied by decisions to back up investments in new types of capabilities with supporting investments in military personnel. Hardware, simply put, requires adequate supporting investments in the hardware to ensure operational efficacy. As the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, stated in the recent U.S. Marine Corps Force Design 2030 report, the warfighting impact of all other future capabilities is directly tied to the level of commitment we are making to training modernization. We will be watching to see how President Tsai balances advances in Taiwan's military readiness with training and force modernization. So as we look to President Tsai's second term, we are expecting that Taiwan will continue to strengthen its military. Taiwan may not have the ability to match China's defense spending, but the department believes that Taiwan has the capacity to provide its military with sufficient resources, the materiel, the manning, the training to deter, delay, or if necessary, defeat a cross-strait invasion. The department will continue to build on our strong history of defense cooperation and engagement with Taiwan to ensure that Taiwan continues to increase its preparedness and response capabilities in a manner that is clear-eyed about the overwhelming threat it faces. We commend the progress that Taiwan has made to date and will continue to encourage and assist President Tsai and her senior military leadership as they operationalize the ODC. As I hope I've made clear this morning, the U.S. Department of Defense remains committed to continued defense and security cooperation with Taiwan during President Tsai's second term. Taiwan has been and will continue to be an important partner for us in the region. We will remain proactive in engaging Taiwan as it adapts its defenses to counter growing challenges and protect its free and democratic way of life. Thanks again for allowing me to make some remarks this morning. I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say and potentially fielding some interesting questions as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Klink, for those clear-eyed and very comprehensive remarks, providing the current DoD's perspective on Taiwan policy and cross-strait relations. Next, we'll have J. Michael Cole provide us with some of his insights on President Tsai's priorities, as well as what he sees over there, really on the ground and in the front line on some of Beijing's tactics towards Taiwan. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Russell, and good evening from the front lines here in Taipei. Yes, indeed, there's going to be a very long list of priorities for President Tsai during her second term, but I'll try to break down what I believe will be the most important elements of that policy. Well, first and foremost, getting COVID-19 out of the way and addressing areas of the economy that have been particularly affected by the outbreak will certainly be a priority for President Tsai. One that only 6 months ago she probably would not have conceived that she needed to prepare for. But luckily for them, for the administration, that should dovetail with plans for the continued development of Taiwan's industries, as she stated in her inaugural address last week. These plans should also include additional moves to further liberalize Taiwan's environment so as to facilitate foreign investment in Taiwan. Among other things, that signifies revising laws and addressing long-standing protectionist tendencies to create a level playing field for foreign firms and investors that are, increasingly looking to Taiwan as a potential destination for their businesses and investment. Doing so amid growing clamor for a global decoupling from China would also be essential if Taiwan is to benefit fully from this potential transition in the global supply chain. Meanwhile, President Tsai will undoubtedly continue to deepen ties with like-minded democracies worldwide. Here again, Taiwan is likely benefiting from changing global attitudes toward China in the wake of and in the midst of COVID-19, particularly with the repeated browbeatings and lecturing by Chinese ambassadors and officials worldwide. This certainly has intensified an acknowledging of what it means to have China as a reality in our everyday lives. And this can only be to Taiwan's benefit. This reaching out to unofficial diplomatic allies and particularly democracies will also be necessary to counter the threat by Beijing to continue poaching official diplomatic allies of the Republic of China, Taiwan. Already a few months prior to the election, the Chinese regime had threatened that if Tsai Ing-wen were re-elected president in January, they would steal every single remaining official ally of Taiwan. Whether they have the ability to make that a reality remains to be seen, but Taiwan certainly cannot afford to stand still, and it needs to deepen its engagement with countries, significant democracies, that can assist Taiwan in remaining a viable state and a player on the global level. That also implies deepening interactions with those democracies at the semi-official level. So oftentimes through Track 1.5 or Track 2 initiatives, programs that were launched a few years ago, such as the Global Cooperation and Training Framework involving US State Department and Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and so on. More and more, there is interest in the Taiwanese government in attracting international NGOs to open up offices in Taiwan. Again, with the current environment in China and now in Hong Kong as well, Taiwan is increasingly seen as a potential destination for their relocation. But there again, Taiwan will need to revise existing laws so that it's easier for international NGOs to set up shop in Taiwan. There is talk at the moment in making that a reality, and we'll see what happens in coming months and years. Another element or component to that strategy as well is finding ways to attract more international media to establish themselves in Taiwan. And here again, with recent waves of expulsions of foreign journalists who were working in China, and no doubt in coming months and years for journalists who are currently based in Hong Kong, doing their job is going to be increasingly difficult. And Taiwan is certainly keen on establishing itself as a regional base for free speech and freedom of the press. So again, there is work being made within the administration right now to make that environment more suitable for foreign reporters. Now, going back to her speech last week, tellingly, unlike her predecessor, President Tsai is not making Taiwan's engagement with global partners conditional or predicated on peaceful cross-strait relations. Instead, she treats those as separate issues. So therefore, she will continue and deepen engagement with other countries. That will continue regardless of the state of cross-strait relations. And I think that's important to bear that in mind. Now, that being said, President Tsai nevertheless remains committed to cross-strait peace and stability. And she is still seeking dialogue with Beijing, but under no preconditions. And certainly not under the one country, two systems formula, which has completely been ruled out as a possible mechanism for Taiwan. Also, her recent inaugural speech made absolutely no reference to the so-called 1992 consensus, which had been set as a precondition for cross-strait dialogue by Beijing. And this time around, she did not even refer to the historical fact that there was a meeting between representatives from the two sides in 1992. So I think that element has very much been put to bed as well. President Tsai remains committed to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait and has made it clear that both sides are responsible for the maintenance of that status quo. So Beijing is as responsible as Taipei in making sure that the status quo is not altered or destabilized. Meanwhile, President Tsai will need to keep in check forces within Taiwan's political spectrum that advocate for de jure independence, or the kind of constitutional change that could spark a crisis in the Taiwan Strait and potentially cost Taiwan's important international support. So again, she needs to strike a proper balance between those desires within the deep green camp, for example, and stability and reassuring international partners, particularly United States. She also will and has stated that she will work to deepen and defend democratic institutions in Taiwan. New sets of laws that were implemented in late 2019 and earlier this year should make it easier for law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and courts to tackle the threat of external interference and political warfare. Obviously, when I say external interference, I am referring to Beijing. And then given the expectations that the CCP will likely ramp up such efforts, those measures will be essential to ensure the prosperity and continued vibrancy of Taiwan's democracy. But meanwhile, she also needs to address the challenge of efforts by China to balkanize Taiwan, most often through the co-optation of local officials, organized crime, and a civil society that is ideologically aligned with Beijing. But at the same time, President Tsai needs to ensure that legislation and measures taken to attack Taiwan's democracy do not end up undermining the very principles. But the challenge here again will be in striking a proper balance, and you do not want to undermine democracy in the defense of democracy. So The administration will have to continue to work with law enforcement, intelligence agencies, civil society, and global partners to counter these types of activities, and certainly the threat represented by disinformation campaigns, which are only intensifying in the cross-strait context. Recent developments across the strait in Hong Kong also now has put pressure on the Tsai administration to adopt a more proactive stance on assisting the people of Hong Kong. But again, she will have to do so in a manner that doesn't entirely destabilize cross-strait relations. That means striking, here again, a balance between appeals to humanitarian considerations, as well as pressures from NGOs, with the need to ensure national security in Taiwan and not prompt retaliatory actions from Beijing. On the defense side, again, there will be an increased focus on deterrence. There will be continued investment in research and the development of military capabilities, primarily in the asymmetrical sphere. We have seen in recent years, and certainly we will continue to see during our second term, greater focus being put on counterforce capabilities, including anti-ship cruise missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and the ranges are now being extended for LACMs as well. And for that, continued US support for the development of a more offensive military capability will be absolutely essential for Taiwan's ability to achieve that. And as was said earlier, a greater focus as well on dispersibility, survivability, AI, UAVs and whatnot will be part of that package. Taipei will have to implement a proper response to the increased frequency of PLA exercises and passages near and around Taiwan, both through the Strait of Miyako and the Bashi Channel, and possibly that could result in more frequent sharing of intelligence with regional allies, particularly United States, but also including Japan, which also faces the same challenges with regards to Strait of Miyako and the East China Sea. Still on military side as well, there is a need for a serious attempt to transform the reserve forces into a combat-ready component for Taiwan's defense. There is a need to implement regular training, or more regular training, that is, mobilization schemes, and to ensure rapid access to armament in times of crisis. And again, where possible, Taiwan will seek to deepen ties with US military, Japanese military self-defense forces, and if possible at all, with regional partners. So I thank you again for giving me a chance to share my views on the subject, and I do look forward to continued discussions.
Thank you very much, Michael, for I think those remarks were I think you covered a wide range, and it was very holistic, and I think it really balances both the domestic as well as international priorities that the President Tsai has. And so I think moving on to the next presenter, we'll have Chip Gregson, who will give us, I think, a hard look at some of the defense challenges that Taiwan faces and U.S. posture with regards to conventional deterrence. Over to you, Chip.
Russell, thank you, and thanks to GTI for this opportunity. I'm happy to report that I endorse completely the views of the previous two speakers. I go to some of the same places, but from a little bit different direction. I'm charged to talk about the potential for US conventional deterrence and what it might mean for Taiwan. It's not a matter of hard power versus soft power or hard power versus sharp power. It's all comprehensive. Mao said political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That applies to power in political warfare too, both soft and sharp. Robust, undoubted conventional deterrence is relevant to ensure that no one is tempted to escalate, to reduce or eliminate the potential for coercion and intimidation. A common charge from the revisionist powers is that a strong conventional deterrent is destabilizing and provocative. That's like saying having a fire department causes fires, or having medical services causes accidents. We shouldn't countenance such a charge from anybody that a strong conventional deterrent is provocative. Right now, we have not one, but two models of US force presence in Asia. One is Korea, where our forces are in contact with hostile foreign forces. We have a combined forces command, which is unique around the world. It's a fight tonight posture for all the forces on the peninsula. And we have high interoperability and integration of alliance forces. We have forces in Japan. It developed there as a sanctuary for war in Korea and Vietnam. It was assumed that forces in Japan, both theirs and ours, were not in contact with hostile forces. And we have, over the years, achieved only limited interoperability between Japanese and US forces. When our forces returned to Asia in response to Kim Jong-il's invasion in 1950, there was no threat of power projection beyond the coastline from North Korea or China. Globally, the United States had air and sea superiority from the end of World War II and unchallenged air and sea superiority from the end of the Cold War. We could and did project power ashore at will. This has all changed now. North Korea and China project power at will continually to coerce and intimidate. And then there's Hong Kong. Xi likely calculates that any US reaction will be bearable. We posed no substantive objection to China's massive dredging operations to build more than 3,000 new acres on top of semi-submerged features. Xi himself declared that China held undisputed historical sovereignty to the waters of the South China Sea, an area half again larger than the Mediterranean. In 2015, Xi told President Obama that the new features would not be militarized. Now, of course, they include 3,000-meter runways, deep water ports, and defensive installations. Elsewhere in the South China Sea, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels harass the drilling and fishing operations of other countries, openly challenging our vision of a free and open region. Sanctions on Chinese entities are likely over Hong Kong, but if they are no more effective at convincing autocratic leaders to change course than our sanctions on North Korea and Iran, they will pose no obstacle. We should certainly impose sanctions, but if only to indicate our displeasure, but they really are a short-term political expedient. We can say we did something, especially if we add a mean-sounding modifier such as crippling. Xi gains a short-term political expedient too. He will cite any sanctions to generate support against our, quote, unjust action, unquote. Japan will certainly note Hong Kong's subjugation as another blow to regional and global security. Other Asian nations lacking comparable security institutions will carefully calibrate their policies to avoid offense. In an earlier Cold War, it was called Finlandization. Democracy is in decline in the region and globally for more than 12 years now. Hong Kong being suppressed will be another democracy, this one with a Chinese face taken off the board. Taiwan is most urgently at risk. The message of Hong Kong is obvious and chilling. Our reaction and that of our allies will be carefully watched and lessons will be drawn. Taiwan is like the Fulda Gap or West Berlin in an earlier era, key terrain that must be held. The US must ensure that Xi bears more than rhetorical opprobrium and assorted sanctions. We must respond in a way that reverses China's growing advantage in force and political coercion. The quickest, most effective response to China's campaign is a strong setback to further expansion. We must renew our role as an ardent advocate and defender of democracy and human rights and strengthen our conventional deterrent. There's several components to this. One is get a message. We're losing the information wars as shown by the decline of democracy in the region. It is not just the corruption of our elections, as bad as that is, it is the weaponization of social media, and we are nearly defenseless. Autocrats from China through Russia to the Islamic State and Iran flood the zone with destructive narratives and disinformation. The result is a well-documented decline of democracy around the globe over the last 12 years. We certainly have the technical ability to compete, but we lack a coherent message and a fact-based, ideals-based vaccination against disinformation. This is fixable. In a doubly ironic twist, our Deputy National Security Advisor recently delivered on 4 May a powerful message to China and our own citizens. He spoke in Mandarin and eloquently described the Chinese May 4th movement of 1919 that supported democratic ideals and contributed substantially to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Human rights are the most powerful component of our brand. It is a feature of our nation, not a bug. From 1950 through 1990, we were an enthusiastic advocate and defender of democracy and human rights. Our message was powerful and spoke eloquently to political prisoners and captive populations, discomfiting authoritarian leaders. Joseph Stalin once asked, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Poland's Cardinal Wojtyla, known as Pope John Paul II, from 1978, helped lead the solidarity movement of some 9.4 million people to gain Poland's freedom from the Soviet Union. Stalin would have envied the Pope's divisions. Component 2, close the range gap. China invests heavily in precision strike weapons to hold our bases and ships in Asia at risk. China has long been building systems that exceed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty range restrictions on short and intermediate range missiles. China was never a party to that treaty, but we were. The treaty is no longer a governing directive, and we need to quickly reduce China's range advantage. The US grew comfortable over recent decades with our unchallenged control of the sea and the airspace above it. We could sail where we wanted and refuel our strike aircraft as often as we wished as they flew to and from their missions. As a result, we largely abandoned strike missiles, and range was not a design priority for our combat aircraft. Mr. Brad Roberts, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, now currently Director of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's Center for Global Security Research, was recently asked how he assessed the current missile capabilities of China and North Korea. His answer, in part, when it comes to short and intermediate range missiles capable of striking Japan and US bases elsewhere in the region, and US forces at sea, the approximate current ratio is that China has approximately 1,900 such missiles and the US has 0. Our bases and ships in the region are all within range. We need to enhance air and missile defenses, and we and our ally Japan need our own strike weapons to hold enemy launch positions at risk. And these must be deployed and employed in a manner that was eloquently described by Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Klink. No long development process is needed. We can purchase systems quickly from our allies. Third component, implement Commander Indo-PACOM's Regain the Advantage plan. Admiral Philip Davidson was recently charged to report directly to Congress on the needs of his command to fulfill the national defense strategy and maintain an edge over China. His report was titled Regain the Advantage, a more active verb, and in my mind, a more accurate description of our challenge. He concluded, quote, "The greatest danger for the United States is the erosion of our conventional deterrence," unquote. This proposal includes a Pacific version of the European Deterrence Initiative, serving the same purpose, discouraging China from aggression in Asia. He has 5 components to this: joint force lethality, force design and posture, strengthening allies and partners, exercises experimentation and innovation, and logistics and security enablers. Last, support joint and combined warfighting with mission-level simulations. Many respected American voices charge that American military supremacy is no longer assured. New domains of conflict have been added to the more familiar air, land, and sea, with the count now reaching 6 or 7, depending on viewpoint. The number and complexity of interactions across all this increases exponentially. Much of our current simulation efforts focus on relatively narrow objectives. What is needed for us in company with our allies is a concerted effort to develop mission and campaign simulations across all services and domains. This can generate valuable learning experience without the associated bill of flying, steaming, and marching. Perhaps even more important, with proper simulation and electronic linking of all our training facilities in the Indo-Pacific, we and our allies can train high-level commanders and their staffs in the art and science of combined warfare, effectively and efficiently integrating the fires and maneuver of our forces to allow us to prevail despite adverse numerical odds and eliminate Chinese ability to coerce and intimidate all of our allies and friends and all of Taiwan's allies and friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chip, for those excellent comments. I'd be no surprise that, of course, I fully agree with everything you've said there. But, you know, I think you really helped really widen the discussion a bit here by taking a broader view of deterrence. And I think, you know, and I think you made the point at the very outset that, you know, we have to look at it both in terms of not only the military side of deterrence, but also the political side of it, and that is a combination of both hard and sharp power. And I think that's that is really, I think, insightful in terms of broadening our perspective on how to achieve deterrence. There's both the political and the military side of it. So, last but not least, we have Steve, who will give us his take on the current developments in cross-strait relations or the cross-strait situation, and also the events going on in Hong Kong and their implications for Taiwan. Steve, over to you. Okay, I'm going to unmute you. Give me a second. I'm trying to unmute you. Hold on one second. Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
I tried. Am I okay?
Yep, you're good now. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Russell and GTI for hosting this timely seminar and for including me. I am up in New Hampshire, where spring is very slowly creeping in on us after a rather cold April and May. But I want my friends who know I love hiking to know that I was up in the White Mountains for 10 hours on Tuesday climbing an isolated peak, and gloriously for 10 hours of hiking I saw no people at all, which was really nice. I'm reminded of an anecdote that shows how far we have come. When I was entering Wesleyan University in 1970, I went to my thesis advisor and I said I wanted to learn Chinese. I had lived in Taiwan as a boy, but unfortunately the DoD schools there offered you a choice of French or Spanish in class. So I learned what Chinese I learned from pedicab drivers, and I can cuss like a pedicab driver if I want. And I do that very seldomly. I do it in Taiwanese as well as Mandarin. And as a 12, 13-year-old boy, I learned some pretty strong language. Later on, when I started college, I wanted to learn Chinese, and I went to my thesis advisor at Wesleyan, and I told him this in 1970, and he looked rather uncomfortable, and he said, well, we don't offer Chinese here. I said, why not? And he looked at me and he said, well, what would you use it for? That underscores how far we have come over the last 50 years, because now I think Chinese is one of the more popular languages for people around the world to learn. And as far as the situation we're dealing with now, I'll quote another great scholar and thinker, Woody Allen, who at one point in one of his movies, he said, we're in a definite kind of situation here. And I think that's an accurate description of East Asia, Taiwan, and especially Hong Kong, which was my last post as a diplomat. At a time when COVID-19 has all of us in lockdown and its accompanying anxieties, China is moving dramatically to testing to removing the last vestiges, of Deng Xiaoping's 40-year-old promise to provide Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy for at least 50 years following its return to PRC sovereignty in 1997. This has direct relevance to Taiwan's situation, as Deng promised that one country, two systems would also ensure that the island could enjoy its autonomy in following any deal to reunite with the mainland. A series of Taiwan governments, both KMT and DPP, have regularly suggested that this formulation offered little of value to the independent 24 million people of the island the Portuguese long ago named Formosa, or the beautiful island. True, the last KMT government of Ma Ying-jeou sought to improve cross-strait relations under the vague and disputed concept of one country, two systems. Through all this time, the prevailing view was that Taiwan was very different from Hong Kong, and therefore any arrangement Beijing reached with the former British colony would not be applicable to the citizens of Taiwan. I used to summarize the situation in the following manner. When things in Hong Kong were going well, people on Taiwan said, that has nothing to do with us and our relationship with China. When, as now, things are not going so well with Hong Kong, Taiwan's reaction is, see what you get when you trust China's promises. Well, things are not going well in Hong Kong today. And I'm not sure just why Emperor Xi has decided to ratchet up tension with Hong Kong now. Is it because the PRC economy is in trouble after decades of sustained growth? Is it because Xi needs a crisis to quell concern within his own inner circle over his unilateral decision to declare himself ruler for life? Now, Secretary Pompeo has weighed in, questioning America's commitment under U.S. legislation to support Hong Kong's special status. All of this suggests troubling times for the 7 million residents of Hong Kong. I see that President Tsai has been welcoming Hong Kongers to move to Taiwan, and they are doing so by the thousands. But that's not going to be sufficient if the confidence of Hong Kong continues to plummet. Canada, the United States, Singapore, and Europe, especially the UK, can and should absorb some number of Hong Kongers, especially those with documents linking them to those places. But the real short-sightedness of Xi's latest unforced error is to further alienate the citizens of Taiwan to Beijing's blandishments, just as President Tsai takes the oath of office for her second tour. I don't know how the Pan-Blue camp is going to manage this, since under Ma Ying-jeou, they tried to find more common ground across the Taiwan Strait. This gets harder and harder to sustain as China violates both the spirit and the letter of one country, two systems. So events in Hong Kong and China will continue to help define politics in Taiwan. Thus far, the political process in the United States has mostly eschewed cross-strait politics, but the recent focus on Hong Kong seems to be changing that. President Trump has swung from a largely pro-China policy in the early days to a relationship largely defined by his unhappiness over the huge trade deficit. Other than accepting a congratulatory call from President Tsai in fall of 2015, Trump has had not much to say about Taiwan. His administration, particularly Secretary of State Pompeo, has been openly critical of recent Chinese actions toward Hong Kong, though Mr. Trump has not, to my knowledge, weighed in on that current situation himself. And just overnight, Assistant Secretary of State Stilwell just reinforced this message in an interview aired yesterday. Congress has and will continue to play a key role in championing Taiwan's interests, a situation that dates back at least 50 years. Taiwan's assiduous effort to foster closer relations with many U.S. state governments and even cities and local governments continues to ensure a broad base of supporters in this country. Beijing's extremely short-sighted expulsion of leading U.S. news organizations like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal has also redounded to Taiwan's benefit, as many expelled correspondents have now decamped to China, and we're getting better coverage by the mainstream American media as a result. To sum up, Taiwan's stock is up in the U.S. and China's is down. Hong Kong adds to broad U.S. popular unhappiness with the authoritarian regime in Beijing. President Tsai, a graduate of Cornell, understands all this well and can be expected to continue fostering close, albeit unofficial, ties to the U.S. Her recent transits of the United States attest to this. I look forward to the discussion period and a chance to continue to share views with my fellow panelists and friends at GTI. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those comments, Steve. I think you really hit the nail on the head in identifying the growing complexity in cross-strait relations with, or maybe even clarity in cross-strait relation that has come about as a result of the events unfolding in Hong Kong, and for Taiwan and for broader policies related to Taiwan and the region. So now we have about 30 minutes for a discussion as well as audience Q&A, which will be for the last 15 minutes. And I'd like to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and present a few questions that I have that's been on my mind. I'd like to start off with a question for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Klink. The most recent National Defense Authorization Act of FY20 has required a couple of reports to Congress regarding the Taiwan Relations Act, as well as issues with cybersecurity issues with Taiwan. Do you have any sort of updates that you may be able to share with regards to the DoD's assessment on the issues of cybersecurity cooperation with Taiwan, and as well as the report regarding the Taiwan's Relations Act?
So let me just share, as I'm sure former ASD Gregson will appreciate, we in the department always relish additional reporting requirements levied upon us through relevant legislation. So, it keeps everybody, I guess, focused, and we in the Pentagon, of course, are okay with all that. With respect to specific cooperation that the department may or may not be engaged with Taiwan, I prefer not to comment on that, to be perfectly frank with you. But as I mentioned in my remarks, and what some of our colleagues also mentioned in theirs, and which is probably known to most of the observers and folks that are listening in on this discussion today, obviously the threat picture in the region has changed. And I would tell you, in my opinion, from a military and the defense and a security perspective, the status quo in the Taiwan Strait has changed. It's no longer the status quo was based on a balance of power. And I would offer that I think that balance is now completely out of balance in favor of the PRC and the PLA. And the stability that Taiwan, mainland China, the United States, and the rest of the region had enjoyed for many, many decades was based on a balance, because it provided for a certain level of stability, a certain level of predictability. And I think that over the years, the PRC has gone out of its way to unilaterally change that status quo through its force deployments opposite Taiwan. Everybody knows about the thousands of missiles pointed at Taiwan. But people may not be as fluent in, unless they're, of course, keen observers of the PLA, is the force posture that they have undertaken and the force structure changes that they have undertaken to give them a more expeditionary capability, to provide additional amphibious capabilities. And if you look at their training, it's focused on Taiwan scenarios. And as an American, I'm also particularly disturbed by the fact that it's focused on impeding our ability to potentially assist Taiwan or other regional partners for that matter. So we obviously take the TRA very seriously, as well as the provisions within the NDAA 2020 that underscore the department's role in ensuring that Taiwan has a self-defense capability, and ensuring that U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific are postured to respond appropriately to challenges. So with or without particular reporting requirements, we'd be doing this anyway. We, of course, in the Pentagon have a very close partnership with the relevant combatant command at INDOPACOM at Camp Smith in Hawaii. And they, of course, are focused on scenarios involving, amongst other things, PLA aggression. So these are some of the things that drive our daily activities. And they also drive our engagement with Taiwan, because we need to ensure that Taiwan prioritizes the defense capabilities that they need. Because quite frankly, they really only have one mission, if you think about it, okay? Defense of Taiwan, that's it. The key factor here is that, they can't afford to get that wrong. So, so we want to work, as we have over the previous years, hand in glove with Taiwan to ensure that they are able to provide a deterrent effect to the degree that the PLA will never try to do something rash.
And thank you for that. I want to build off on something that Chip had brought up in his opening statement, and that is regarding the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And I believe Chip's successor, also the current chairman of the Project 2049 Institute, Randy Schreiber, and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, had penned an article just calling for a Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And I imagine the reason why there is a call for such an initiative is that currently does not exist. And so I suppose the question for both, I think, Das D. Klenk as well as Chip is, what are your thoughts on building on this, on what the need for such a Pacific Deterrence Initiative? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll volunteer to go first, I guess, since Das D. Klenk just had a lengthy engagement on this. A sense of urgency is needed. We just talked about the fact that the status quo has changed across the straits, that the PLA has changed their force structure. I tried to indicate in my remarks that the PLA is continually projecting force into Japanese waters, Japanese territorial airspace, Taiwanese airspace, Taiwanese territorial waters. They're in the territorial waters of the other nations in Southeast Asia. This is power projection. They're not there on a goodwill cruise. This is power projection. And we need a way to be able to operate within range of the Chinese missile arsenal in a way where we're not only survivable, but effective. And the idea of a widely distributed, maneuverable, decentralized networked force operating along the first island chain littoral to assist our naval and air forces in maintaining sea and air superiority and in protecting the territory, the interest, and the lives of our allies and friends is absolutely necessary. And we need to move on this now. People that are closer to Congress than I am will know where this generated from, but it's interesting that Congress asked Admiral Davidson to report to them on what he needs. Well, this is very interesting. And Admiral Davidson, maybe it was accidental, but I put some meaning to it, changed the verb from maintain to regain. And I think there's something to be said here. If you track back to Admiral Davidson's testimony in front of Congress, his first testimony when he was the Indo-PACOM commander, he put much of this into his remarks, and it ended up like most reports to Congress. It's interesting, and it went into the archives somewhere. But now we're finally acting on this. COVID-19 is certainly going to affect our budget. This Pacific Deterrent Initiative, to match the European Deterrent Initiative, is something that ought to qualify for overseas contingency operation funding, so we can move on this. The other interesting thing that's in many things in Admiral Davidson's report are interesting, but the idea of enhanced training capabilities and enhanced simulation allows us to start putting together very rapidly the ability to fight as a much more effective alliance than we're currently capable of doing today. There's nothing like going through problems, letting all the powers of artificial intelligence, et cetera, impact on the commanders and their decisions. And you come up with the result and say, gee, that's bad. How do we fix this? And then you go and fix it, and you run through it again, and you get into spiraling improvement and spiraling confidence. This spiraling upward of confidence in turn helps support all the things about sending our message, and gives the Japanese and the Taiwanese and perhaps other nations the confidence that we got this, we can handle this. We're not going to run off and invade the mainland of China, but we are going to be able to mount a very effective, efficient, and powerful defense of our own territory, our allies and our friends, and protect their lives and their businesses. And the charge will certainly, if we're successful, the charge will certainly be made that this is provocative, and we should be very prepared to say this is bunk. It's only provocative if you plan to take something from us that belongs to us. We've watched since Xi Jinping became the supreme leader in China. We've watched one expansion piece after another, after another, after another. It's time that we realize that they're not following our script of liberalizing as they become more wealthy and more successful. We need to look to our own defenses, and nobody knows that better than Taiwan, who are sitting there right across the strait, of being able to operate while under attack, which is going to require some changes in doctrine, some changes in force structure, some changes in weapons capabilities. All these are doable. The technology's there. We got to get out of our own way. We got to quit admiring the problem, and we got to make a move on this.
Dastey, Clink, do you have any comments to add, or you want to?
So I would just say that I'm aligned with what General Gregson just said, particularly with respect to required changes in doctrine, joint warfighting concepts, and the like. And again, it goes back to some of my opening comments. It's not just about hardware, it's about how we employ that hardware. And it requires a change, an evolution, perhaps even a revolution in the way we think. And we need to make sure our allies and partners are part of that, because that remains our competitive advantage. But, I would say, process notwithstanding, the intent of the PDI is something that obviously we support in the department. As everybody knows, when the National Defense Strategy came out, it very clearly stated that the Indo-Pacific is our primary theater. If you look at budgets, that statement might be called into question a little bit. And the reality is, and everybody who's served in government realizes this, that strategy is budget and budget is strategy. So the budgets have to reflect the priority that the government has placed on the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks for that. I'd like to pull on a thread that got 2 thumbs up from Chip Gregson there. Let me pull on a thread that was raised by Chip and also Michael in his comments, which is about the when Michael was mentioning how one of the priorities of the Tsai administration will be to enhance relationship with not only the United States, but also countries like Japan, for instance, and I think Chip Gregson, you mentioned also Japan in your remarks just now. And I wanted to just to get a take from the panel, but maybe perhaps specifically Chip and Dastey Klink, if you can, with regards to your thoughts on the possibility, the practicability of facilitating security cooperation between Taiwan and Japan, which I think has quite aligned security concerns with regards to with regards to China and what's happening in the region. Sort of any thoughts on the possibility of higher level security cooperation consultations between Taiwan and Japan, and what role the United States can play in that?
So I would start by saying that, last summer within OSD policy, there was a reorganization that took place that within the DASD ship that I am currently charged with, DASD East Asia, it basically created a DASD ship focused on allies and partners in the region, Taiwan being one of them, notwithstanding that I also have North Korea, just to keep things interesting. But the focus being on allies and partners, if you will, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the like. So that was not just by happenstance. We certainly encourage any of our allies to enhance their security dialogue with Taiwan counterparts. We believe that giving Taiwan as much international space as possible is in the interest of like-minded democracies in the region and globally, quite frankly. So, if Tokyo and Taipei are able to enhance the types of relationships that that already currently exist, Washington certainly is in favor of that.
I would add that Taiwan's security is Japan's security, and vice versa. The southernmost and westernmost part of Japan is south of Taipei, and it's close enough to the island that you can see Taiwan from Yonaguni. So the Japanese movements of late to create a Western Wall, they call it, with ground self-defense forces going into Yonaguni, going into Miyako-jima, going into Shimoji-jima and Ishigaki-jima, all of which, I might add, contrary to conventional thinking, it'll never happen. The politics will never support it. The politics support it. The politics of the people in these islands support it. As we start moving toward the force posture that Heino mentioned of asymmetric, enhanced reserves, and the distributed, maneuverable, decentralized, et cetera, it'll generate cooperation by imitation. The Americans are fond of going to Taipei, and I've done it, and to Taiwan, Kaohsiung, and other places, and saying to our Taiwan friends, you got to get more joint, you got to do this, you got to do that. That's fine, but once we start doing it, once we start getting into more and more combined capability with our allies and friends, wonderful things will happen. Not only are we creating a more secure environment for Taiwan and the region generally, but we're also taking a lot of the experimentation on our part and coming up with something that the Taiwanese can readily adapt to, and something that I think would raise the confidence and raise the status of all of Taiwan's armed forces within Taiwan society, which should generate more support. So this is a righteous circle, but we need to start this spiral improvement just as quickly as possible. I go back to my fundamental, I guess, worry is that the recent actions with Hong Kong indicate that we need a renewed sense of urgency here. This is not a problem that's off in the misty future somewhere. This is literally on our doorstep. Thank you.
Ambassador Young, Steve, I have a question for you. And as I mentioned at in my opening introduction, the Congress as well as President had signed the Taipei Act, the Taiwan Allies International Protection Enhancement Initiative, which include measures there about the need to enhance, to elevate, or decrease, U.S. diplomatic, economic, political support for, Taiwan's diplomatic as well as non-diplomatic allies, partners, in relations to their what their actions vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so as the only professional diplomat on our panel, and certainly the most eminently qualified to sort of to assess this, I mean, what is the sort of practical application of the Taipei Act in terms of how the United States may put or utilize this, and maybe do you have any sort of insights on that?
Well, thank you for the question, and also for this very good gathering. I have long been one of those who counseled quietly my friends in Taiwan that, understandable as it is for them to focus on their diplomatic allies, most of whom are pretty small countries that are getting paid through assistance and other benefits to maintain their relationship with Taiwan, that while I can't ask them to walk away from that, I simply stress that their real benefactors are much more the United States, Japan, and other countries who either directly with Taiwan or indirectly through their suspicion of China, and that includes almost every state which shares a land border with China. Let's say Vietnam, Japan, Korea, India, all are very concerned by Chinese behavior. And so there really is an important factor there. And I think my friends in Taiwan understand it. I mean, Joseph Wu and I have talked about this, President Tsai and I have talked about this, yes, they love to have those flags out in front of the foreign ministry that shows the countries that still recognize them, but most of us couldn't find them on a map. And the real benefactors for Taiwan in the long run have to include countries that, for geopolitical reasons, long ago shifted their formal diplomatic relationship to Beijing, but continue to be important economic, political, and defense friends of Taiwan's.
I have so many other questions I want to ask the panel, but I do want to give our audience a chance to get some of their questions in. And so I'd like to move to the audience Q&A, and we have quite a few questions. And so let me start off with the first question from Tina Chung, who is a reporter with the Voice of America. Her question, as U.S. support for Taiwan becomes more visible, there are discussions among observers of this evolving relationship on how the U.S. might help or hurt Taiwan due to implications from Beijing's reactions and actions against Taiwan. As we've seen, Mr. Joseph Wu, Taiwan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, has issued an alert this week that Taiwan could be next for China after the national security law measure taken by China on Hong Kong. The question is for Deputy Assistant Secretary Klink and all the panelists. For military planners, what kind of approach is the U.S. taking to prepare or prevent for China's military move against Taiwan? And for the administration as a whole, is the U.S. ready to take on a more challenging China after what are perceived as its very, quote, aggressive and assertive moves in the region? And it gives example, Indian military exercises, South China Sea, East China Sea, and around Taiwan. Perhaps that's D. Klink.
Well, thank you very much for that. So just a couple overarching statements, I would say. The reason that the United States has a military, first and foremost, is to deter conflict. Again, as I said yesterday, with respect to Beijing, if Xi Jinping convenes the CMC and directs the CMC members to take some sort of offensive action somewhere, we want those professionals in uniform to have doubt in their mind that they can actually execute the order that's been given to them. So our military, and this is not just in the Indo-Pacific, but worldwide, is designed to deter conflict. And if that deterrence fails, to ensure that we dominate the adversary and defeat them. That's why democracies have militaries at the end of the day, whether it's the United States, Taiwan, Japan, or anybody else. That's why we exist. We have plans for every type of scenario you can envision and some beyond that with respect to challenges that the United States may face globally. So for instance, just with respect to COVID-19, the Department of Defense has been planning for and has modeled and simulated and trained its response to pandemics. So any scenario you can pretty much imagine, we have done some thinking about and we've done some planning for. With respect to visible support or not visible support to Taiwan, I will tell you I'm less about symbolism and more about efficacy. So for instance, why we are such advocates for Taiwan's ODC is because we believe that Taiwan needs a balanced mix of both conventional and asymmetric means. And as last year's historic arms sale package to Taiwan focused on more conventional forces, F-16s, M1A2s, we now believe that a focus needs to be on asymmetric means. And frankly, some of those things, from a military perspective, as somebody, who used to wear a uniform, some of those things might not be as sexy as a main battle tank or a fighter aircraft, but in deterring and need be defeating the PLA, they're much, much more useful, frankly. And I think maybe this is even more important. Again, it creates doubt, or it should create doubt, in PLA calculus. And that again goes to deterrence, which is our number one focus, if you will, on a day-to-day basis.
Any comments from the other panelists?
This is Chip here. I strongly concur with Dasty Klink.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on to the next question from Mike Mossatig, PBS Online News Hour. And this is not addressed to any specific panelists, so this is free for all here. How high or low do you rate the risk that if Xi interprets tepid U.S. response to China in breaking Hong Kong's autonomy, that he will feel emboldened to take more vigorous or dangerous action against Taiwan? I mean, considering the question, maybe this is good for Ambassador Young here.
Yes, it is a good question, and it's a concern for me to be simple-minded. Two things that differ between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Taiwan has its own military capabilities, and it also has 90 miles of water between it and China. Probably Das Klink and General Gregson could do a better job than me, but my sense is that Taiwan has been focusing more effectively on asymmetrical means of defending itself, not only on the beaches, but particularly if, well, in the Taiwan Strait, on the beaches, and keeping any force that tries to attack from gaining a foothold inside the island. All of these are huge challenges for any defense, and I think that PLA has a lot of problems behind the scenes in terms of its capabilities. But I'm frankly stunned that China is trampling on its own solemn commitments to Hong Kong in such a cavalier manner. And I've been interviewed by various groups, and I've tried to figure this out. And the best I can think is that Xi Jinping is in some trouble domestically, and he's trying to distract his population from their economic travails and other problems by doing something that he believes will be popular with the people of China. I'm not even sure that's a good gamble, but you know, I really feel for my many friends in Hong Kong as they face something that all of us hoped would never happen, and the danger of escalation to sending in People's Armed Police or even PLA forces, either from the garrison in Hong Kong or from across the border in southern China, is just heartrending for anybody who cares about Hong Kong. So there's a question of why they're doing this, and how can they expect it to actually enhance their power, that I think all of us should be asking.
Okay. Michael, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I mean, we also have to assume that Xi Jinping and other CCP decision makers are calculating rationally. If we assume that, I would say that the potential for disaster for the PLA trying to invade Taiwan and the pacification that will be required to bring a population of 23.8 million people to heel is by orders of magnitude more demanding and complicated than any attempt to impose controls over Hong Kong. So we need to keep in mind, unless the theory that Xi Jinping is facing serious pressures domestically so that he feels compelled to externalize and create conflict outside Taiwan proper, I'm still not quite convinced that there's a logical next step following Hong Kong in one that would involve a direct attempt to take Taiwan by force. We certainly need to be prepared for that kind of contingency. But I think we also need to be careful not to see a logical follow-up to developments in Hong Kong.
And building on Hong Kong, there seems to be a lot of interest about Hong Kong from our audience. This question is from David Tsai, who is a counselor with GTI. And he addressed this question specifically for Deputy Assistant Secretary Klink, but I think this could also be opened up for the other panelists as well. He says, well, given the Hong Kong situation being what it is, and I would just add here that given Secretary Pompeo's designation of Hong Kong's autonomy, with regards to the Hong Kong Policy Act, would the U.S. reconsider or consider a port call to Taiwan instead of Hong Kong in the future? So, question for Das Klink and also the panelists who would like to take this question.
So, frankly, I haven't really put that much thought into it. That being said, obviously our relationship with Taiwan is unofficial. We do not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, as everybody knows, and port calls come with certain displays of sovereignty. So there would be some challenges associated with that, to be perfectly frank. So we have not looked into that very closely. As I just stated, I'm less interested in symbolism and more interested in actual capabilities that deter. So that's what my focus has been on. So we have not thought about port calls or changing port calls.
Thank you. Any other panelists who would like to weigh in on that? No? Okay. All right. Moving on to the next question here. This question is from Zach Lombardo. The incremental strengthening of U.S.-Taiwan relations since 2016 has largely not been emulated by America's Five Eyes and other allies. What are American expectations of partners and our other allies in the region in support of America's commitments to Taiwan? This is not a question addressed to any panelists in particular, so please feel free to weigh in. Okay, Steve. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a good question, and I think that while countries around the region are probably very reluctant to speak publicly, if you're Vietnam or Thailand or India or so many other countries on the periphery of China, any attempt to threaten Taiwan would be viewed as a very serious possible threat to them as well. I know that the informal relationship between Taiwan and Vietnam, for example, is quite robust. And I think India is another place, although they're always trying to be very careful, where Taiwan has resonance because of its open democratic society, for example. So these guys are watching all of this very carefully. And as I've written in the past and will again, any attempt by China to attack Taiwan not only is fraught with the very real possibility that they'll fail, especially if the United States gets involved, but even if it doesn't, hopefully that would never be the case. It would be a huge setback to a regime that is facing some legitimacy questions because of this economic downturn that I think are long overdue. So I think it would be foolish, but foolish is not impossible.
Chip, I think you have a quick comment that you wanted to add.
Yes, two quick ones. On the most recent discussion here about allies and others in the region, I go back to what I was trying to recommend on our national message. We need to create the environment where our allies can be more vocal and more demonstrative about support for human rights, support for democracy, all these other things, rather than making it a specific, I support Taiwan. It supports self-determination, you support Taiwan, but let's go to first principles and do that one. The second thing, and this goes to maybe avoiding future surprise, Xi Jinping got rid of collective leadership in China, and Xi Jinping also is virtually eliminated. He's eliminated term limits. He's got one more election to go. Then I guess he achieves another title or something. All absolute dictators have their own constituency that they have to take care of. They leave office only by coup or by coffin, and Xi absolutely cannot compromise on anything. So our choice to make sure that he makes the right decisions all the time is to make absolutely sure he never wakes up some morning and thinks he can get across that 90 miles between the mainland and Taiwan in an acceptable manner.
Michael, I think you have a question you wanted to weigh in on this also as well.
Yeah, to the question on the willingness of other allies to work with Taiwan or with the United States on Taiwan, I think again the example set by GCTF is an interesting precedent. Just last year alone, historically GCTF had involved U.S. and Taiwan only. Last year at a GCTF on combating disinformation, which is very focused on China, we had both Japan and Sweden participate and officially co-organize that event. What it shows is, first of all, that formula, that model is working, it's appealing, but equally important is the fact that it's survivable for those countries. Large country like Japan, medium power at most like Sweden, they participated, their representative to Taiwan spoke publicly, gave remarks at the event, and the sky didn't fall on Sweden. And I think a lot of countries are taking notice, particularly amid COVID-19, where we've seen a constellation of countries worldwide, including small ones, decide to collaborate with Taiwan, receive assistance from Taiwan, work with Taiwan. They were browbeaten and threatened by the Chinese, but then what it is that China can actually do. So I think the more countries choose to stand up to China, and with the necessary US leadership, I think we're going to start seeing more and more of those countries joining those initiatives. The United States is certainly not going to say no, and Taiwan is definitely not going to say no either. So I think the next year or so, we're going to start seeing even more of this type of collaboration. These are baby steps. This is not official recognition of Taiwan or anything, but this focuses on very constructive global problems, and it's one way to bring in Taiwan as a partner for international community. So I'm quite positive that we're going to start seeing more of these kinds of interactions with a number of countries.
Thank you for those excellent comments. Unfortunately, we've exhausted all the time that we have allotted for today's discussion, but I want to give our panelists a chance to part with some final words. Certainly not the final words on this ongoing discussion, but maybe some final comments for today's session. Maybe start. Does any of the panelists have any final comments they would like to add? Oh, all right. We got Dusty Klink and also Steve as well.
So I'll just finish with, first of all, again, thank you, Russell, and the GTI for convening this. It's been very interesting, and I appreciate all the comments from my colleagues and the great questions as well. Two thoughts that I would just like to underscore. Number one, that the United States is committed to maintaining its very, very robust, albeit unofficial relationship with Taiwan in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act. And, we talked about the Taipei Act, but, let's also remember there's been other legislation that's been passed by an overwhelming bipartisan support over the last several years that has only underscored our continued commitment based on the foundational legislation, the TRA, but the Taipei Act, the Taiwan Travel Act, aspects of obviously NDAA 2020, and others. So again, bipartisan support in Congress for laws signed by President Trump. So there should be no doubt as to our commitment. Moreover, again, as some of my colleagues have already stated, that the trend lines of CCP action, whether it's today in Hong Kong or a couple months ago coming out of Wuhan, should give everyone at least a bit of clarity as to the as we say in the military, the TTPs that the CCP employs. So if there's any silver lining here, any silver lining at all, it should be that the international community, so not just U.S. partners and allies, but also some countries that might be sitting on the fence, it should give them clarity as to what a world order led by the CCP would look like and the impact it would have on its people. Thank you.
Steve, over to you. The last word.
Yeah, well, first of all, I've got to tip my hat to my old friend Chip Gregson on Coors Coffin. I love that. Never heard it before, and it's definitely should be on Xi Jinping's mind. I think he's taken a big gamble with Hong Kong, and I think that given the unhappiness of people around him of his declaration of Mao-like status and staying in power as long as he lives makes him much more vulnerable to one or the other of Chip's options. But the bigger question, of course, for many of us is why has China remained so authoritarian for so long when many theorists believe that a rising middle class would eventually create insuperable pressure for a system to open up as it has in most of East Asia. This was a great session. GTI is a great organization, and I appreciate being a part of it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. The recording for this session will be available on our website. And please stay safe and healthy, everyone, and take care. Thank you for joining us.